Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Welcome. Before you relax, let me ask you something simple. Long before history was written, before maps existed, humans were already crossing dark waters in fragile boats, guided by memory, stars, and silence. Entire ports were built and quietly abandoned, leaving no trace above the waves. Tonight, you will drift through the slow story of prehistoric boats and lost harbors, a calm journey where nothing rushes, nothing surprises, and everything fades gently into rest. Settle in, let the pace slow, and allow this boring history to carry you toward sleep. Human history did not begin with writing, but with movement. And long before words were carved into stone, humans carved paths across water. Before the wheel ever turned on land, boats were already floating, because land resists while water invites. Rivers became the first highways, coastlines the first settlements, and the sea the first unanswered question. In the Ice Age, when much of the world was frozen and survival itself was uncertain, humans still shaped wood, grass, bone, and animal hide into vessels that could float. They did not know the earth was round, did not understand magnetism or geometry, but they understood the rhythm of waves, the return of stars, and the language of wind. Sea levels were lower then, and places that are now drowned once held forests, camps, and ports. Entire lands like Doggerland vanished, not in war or fire, but silently, as water rose year after year. There were harbors without maps, ports without names, and trade without money. Salt, stone, shells, tools, and stories moved from shore to shore. Knowledge survived not in books, but in memory, repeated aloud until it became instinct. These early sailors did not trust sails because wind could betray them. They trusted oars because muscle obeyed the mind. Storms were the greatest enemy, and the sea was the harshest teacher. Many voyages had no return plan because the idea of return itself was uncertain. Civilizations disappeared quietly, leaving no ruins of stone because wood rots, leather dissolves, and the ocean keeps what it takes. What we now call myth may often be distorted memory, where drowned ports became cities of gods and lost fleets turned into curses. Stone anchors, submerged walls, and unnatural alignments beneath the sea hint that humans once lived where fish now swim. History ignored them because there were no kings, no wars, no written records. Only when archaeology learned to dive did it become clear that cities were not only built on land. Even now, evidence is scarce and questions are many. Perhaps we will never know everything because some history was never meant to survive. These boats were not technology, they were necessity. These ports were not economies, they were lives. Just as we feel blind today without GPS and maps, early humans learned to navigate blindness itself. History is not always written, some of it sinks. and the places where it sinks are often the most honest. It is possible that beneath your own city there was once a shoreline, a dock, a human standing at the edge of water, wondering if crossing it would mean survival or something entirely new. We remember only what remains, and we leave the rest to the sea. Human movement across water did not happen once, but again and again, slowly expanding outward like ripples that never fully disappear. Each generation inherited the sea not as a mystery to solve, but as a fact to accept. Children grew up hearing where the currents pull strongest, where the fog lies, where the stars tilt differently at night. This knowledge was not written down because writing was unnecessary when repetition was constant and survival depended on memory. Boats changed shape depending on water and purpose, narrow for rivers, wide for coasts, heavy for cargo, light for escape. There was no single design, only adaptation. Along submerged coastlines, temporary ports formed where boats could rest, repair, and exchange goods. And when the sea rose or storms shifted the shore, those ports were abandoned without ceremony. No one recorded their founding, and no one recorded their end. Trade routes existed long before borders, and movement mattered more than ownership. A shell from a distant shore carried more meaning than gold because it proved that someone had crossed water and returned. Time passed without calendars, marked instead by seasons, tides, and migrations. When climates shifted and ice melted, the sea advanced not violently but persistently, erasing camps, paths, and harbors layer by layer. People moved inland, carrying only what could be remembered. What remained sank. Later civilizations, armed with stone cities and written language, built on higher ground and assumed they were the beginning. They mistook visibility for importance. Underwater archaeology now finds fragments that refuse to fit simple timelines. Stone tools far from shore, walls beneath waves, anchors where no modern harbor exists. These are not anomalies, but reminders that history favored permanence and ignored movement. The sea kept its own archive, one that does not care to be easily read. We search for proof because we are uncomfortable with uncertainty. But early humans lived inside uncertainty and adapted to it. Their success was not dominance over nature, but cooperation with it. They left little behind because they carried everything with them. In that sense, disappearance was not failure, but design. What looks like loss to us may have been continuity to them. The sea did not end their story, it simply carried it forward, wave by wave, beyond the reach of ink and stone. As generations passed, seafaring stopped being an experiment and became routine, so ordinary that it left no mark traumatic enough for later historians to notice. Movement across water was not celebrated, it was expected. A journey across a narrow strait did not feel like exploration, it felt like walking a familiar path that happened to float. The absence of fear did not mean the absence of danger, only the presence of experience. People learned where the sea changed color, where depth dropped suddenly, where birds gathered before land appeared. Navigation relied on repetition, not theory. When stars disappeared behind clouds, memory filled the gap. When storms erased routes, new ones formed. Harbors emerged where geography allowed pause, not where power demanded control. These places had no walls, no monuments, because permanence was never the goal. The sea punished attachment. Anything built to last would eventually be taken, so structures were light, temporary, and replaceable. As sea levels continued to rise, some communities retreated step by step, abandoning familiar shores while maintaining the same way of life. Others stayed too long and vanished, not dramatically, but quietly, absorbed into water and time. Later myths speak of sudden floods and angry gods, but reality was slower and less theatrical. It was patience, not catastrophe, that erased most prehistoric ports. This slowness is why they are hard to find. There is no single moment of destruction to excavate. Only scattered traces remain, interrupted by centuries of sediment. Modern thinking struggles with this kind of loss because it leaves no villain and no lesson. Yet for early humans, adaptation was the lesson itself. Survival depended on flexibility, not resistance. The sea was never conquered, only negotiated with. Even today, when divers descend and find worked stone beneath layers of sand, they are not discovering ruins in the classical sense, but pauses in motion. Each artifact marks a moment when someone stopped long enough to leave something behind. The vast majority left nothing at all. Their history exists not as objects, but as influence, shaping how later humans understood water, distance, and connection. What we call the beginning of civilization may only be the point where movement finally slowed enough to be recorded. As writing finally emerged and settlements grew heavier and more permanent, something subtle was lost alongside what was gained. Fixed cities required fixed memory, and fixed memory favored stone, walls, and authority. The earlier world of water-based life did not disappear because it failed, but because it did not fit the new method of remembering. History became selective, preferring what stayed still over what moved. Boats that once carried families, tools, and beliefs across open water were replaced in memory by ships of conquest and trade, controlled by states. The quiet harbors of prehistory had no place in records designed to glorify power. Even when later civilizations inherited seafaring knowledge, they rewrote its origin story, placing themselves at the beginning and pushing everything before them into shadow. Yet traces endured, in practice if not in text. Coastal communities continued to read tides intuitively. Fishermen followed routes older than any map, and shipbuilders repeated shapes that worked without knowing why they worked. These were echoes of a deeper past, preserved through habit rather than documentation. When modern researchers look for the origins of navigation, they often search for inventions, dates, and names, but the truth resists such framing. There was no single inventor of the boat, no moment when humans suddenly became sailors. There was only gradual familiarity, a slow acceptance that water could be trusted enough to step onto. This acceptance changed everything. It connected continents, spread people, and allowed ideas to travel farther than legs ever could. Without prehistoric seafaring, the world's genetic, linguistic, and cultural maps would look entirely different. Still, the evidence remains fragmented, not because it never existed, but because it was never meant to last. Early humans did not build for us to find. They built for the next tide, the next season, the next crossing. In that way, their world was temporary but complete. What survives now is not a detailed record, but a pattern. Humans following water, adapting to change, and choosing movement over monument. The sea, indifferent and patient, accepted their traces and blurred them until only hints remained. And perhaps that is why these stories feel unfinished, because they never truly ended. They simply flowed forward, carried by currents, embedded quietly in everything that came after. What followed this transition was not a clean break, but a layering, where newer histories settled on top of older ones without fully replacing them. As inland empires rose, coastlines continued to shift, and beneath expanding cities lay the memory of earlier shores. The sea kept advancing and retreating, indifferent to human timelines, repeatedly redrawing the boundary between land and water. Some ports were rebuilt again and again, each version slightly farther inland, each forgetting the one before. Others were abandoned entirely, becoming legends of drowned places spoken of as warnings or wonders. These stories survived precisely because they were vague. Specific details vanished, but the emotional truth remained, that land could be lost, that the sea could reclaim what seemed stable. In this way, prehistoric experience leaked into later belief systems, shaping how floods, oceans, and fate itself were understood. When ancient writers described great deluges, they may not have been inventing catastrophe, but compressing centuries of slow loss into a single dramatic memory. Time does this naturally, smoothing long processes into sharp moments. Archaeology, when it encounters submerged structures, faces this same compression in reverse, trying to stretch fragments back into lived reality. A stone tool found underwater is not just an object out of place, it is evidence that human presence once aligned differently with geography. It challenges the assumption that progress moves only forward and upward. Instead, it suggests cycles of adaptation, retreat, and reorientation. Prehistoric seafarers did not see themselves as pioneers standing at the edge of the unknown. They saw water as part of the landscape, no more alien than forest or plain. Their confidence came not from control, but from familiarity earned over generations. This familiarity is difficult for modern society to imagine, because our distance from nature is measured in infrastructure. We build barriers where they built understanding. And so when we look back, we search for beginnings and breakthroughs, while missing the continuity that made them possible. The lost ports were not failures erased by time, they were solutions that fit their moment perfectly. When conditions changed, the solutions changed too. Nothing about this process was tragic to those living it. Only later, when permanence became the measure of success, did disappearance begin to look like loss. In the modern era, the effort to recover these submerged histories reflects more about present curiosity than past intention. We dive, scan, and measure because we are uncomfortable with gaps, because a story without a clear beginning and end feels incomplete. Yet prehistoric life along water was not structured as a narrative, it was structured as continuity. Each shoreline was temporary, each route adjustable, each harbor a pause rather than a destination. When we attempt to map these worlds, we impose fixed lines onto what was once fluid. Sonar images and sediment layers provide hints, but they cannot capture routines, decisions, or meanings. A cluster of stones may mark a landing place, or it may mark nothing at all. Certainty remains elusive, and that uncertainty is often mistaken for absence. This is why so much early seafaring is described cautiously, framed as possibility rather than fact. But absence of proof does not equal absence of practice. Movement leaves fewer traces than monuments, and the people who relied on it understood this intuitively. They did not expect their lives to be preserved. What mattered was transmission, not preservation. Skills were passed on, not archived. Roots were remembered, not recorded. When those chains of transmission broke, the knowledge vanished with them, leaving behind only indirect signs. The sea accelerated this erasure, softening edges and redistributing material until context dissolved. Even so, the influence persists. Patterns of settlement, genetic links across water, and shared mythological themes all point back to a time when crossing seas was ordinary. These connections exist whether or not we can trace every step. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that the story of prehistoric boats and lost ports cannot be fully recovered because it was never fully separable from daily life. It was not an achievement to be commemorated, but a condition of existence. To understand it, we must accept that much of human history unfolded without leaving a readable trace, and that invisibility does not diminish importance. The sea did not erase these lives, it simply carried them beyond the reach of our methods, preserving their impact while dissolving their details. As we reach the furthest edge of what can be inferred, the temptation is to force closure, to decide where uncertainty must end and explanation must begin. But the prehistoric relationship with water resists finality. It existed before borders, before ownership, before the idea that land could be fixed and claimed indefinitely. Coastlines were understood as temporary agreements between earth and sea, not permanent boundaries. Living with that understanding shaped behavior, expectations, and values. Risk was accepted as ordinary, loss as anticipated, change as inevitable. In such a world, a harbor was not a possession, but an opportunity, useful only as long as conditions allowed. When it ceased to function, it was left behind without regret. This mindset contrasts sharply with later civilizations that invested meaning in permanence and equated endurance with success. From that later perspective, disappearance looks like failure. From the earlier one, it was simply adjustment. This difference explains why prehistoric ports feel elusive. They were never meant to anchor identity. Identity traveled with people, not with places. The sea, far from being an obstacle, was the medium through which connection happened. It shortened distances, equalized landscapes, and allowed ideas to spread gradually without centralized control. Long before empires used ships to dominate, ordinary people used boats to survive, to explore nearby horizons, and to maintain relationships across water. This quiet mobility shaped humanity more deeply than recorded conquests ever could. When we look at the global distribution of humans today, separated by oceans, yet linked by shared traits, we are seeing the long-term result of countless small crossings that went unrecorded. The lack of detail frustrates modern inquiry, but it also invites humility. Not all history is meant to be catalogued, and not all influence announces itself. Some of the most decisive human adaptations happened without witnesses, documents, or monuments. They happened in silence, guided by necessity, and reinforced by repetition. In acknowledging this, we shift our focus from what can be proven to what can be reasonably understood. The story does not end with a discovery or a conclusion, but with recognition. The prehistoric boat and the lost port are not missing chapters waiting to be found. They are reminders that much of humanity's past was lived in motion, shaped by water, and trusted to memory rather than stone. That trust carried our species forward, even if it left us with little to point to now, except the world we inhabit as its outcome. Beyond recognition lies reflection, where the absence of detail becomes its own form of evidence. The fact that so little remains forces us to reconsider how history is valued and whose experiences are deemed worth preserving. Prehistoric seafarers did not fail to leave records. They simply lived in a way that did not prioritize permanence. Their success was measured in continuity of life, not continuity of structure. Every safe crossing, every seasonal return, every remembered route was proof enough. When later societies built archives and monuments, they did so out of fear of loss, attempting to freeze moments against time. Earlier societies accepted time as a condition, not an enemy. This acceptance produced a different kind of resilience, one that did not depend on accumulation or control. The sea rewarded this attitude by offering access, food, and connection, while punishing rigidity. Those who adapted survived, those who insisted on staying were absorbed. Over thousands of years, this rhythm shaped humanity's spread across the planet. Islands were reached not by grand expeditions, but by incremental confidence. Short crossings became longer ones, familiarity expanded, and the horizon moved outward. None of this required intention in the modern sense. It required only the willingness to trust water enough to step onto it again. When we search for the origins of civilization, we often look for density, walls, and hierarchy, but beneath those visible markers lies a quieter foundation built on movement and exchange. Without boats, there would have been no shared technologies, no overlapping cultures, no gradual weaving of human networks across continents. The lost ports matter not because they were impressive, but because they were functional. They allowed life to flow. Their disappearance does not erase their role, it confirms it. They served their purpose and then yielded to change. In this way, the sea becomes both archive and editor, preserving outcomes while discarding process. What remains is not a complete story, but a direction of travel. Humanity moved outward, followed water, and learned to live with uncertainty. That lesson persists even now as coastlines shift once more and familiar ground becomes unstable. The prehistoric past does not warn us with words, but with patterns. It shows that survival has never depended on resisting change, only on responding to it. And so the story ends where it began, not with writing or discovery, but with motion. A human stands at the edge of water, aware that the shore behind them is temporary, aware that the water ahead is uncertain, and steps forward anyway. After that step forward, there is no final scene, only continuation, because this kind of history does not resolve into an ending. The water closes behind the boat, leaving no path to trace, no line to follow back. What mattered was never the mark left behind, but the crossing itself. Over countless generations, this pattern repeated until it became invisible, embedded into humanity so deeply that later ages mistook it for instinct rather than inheritance. Even now, when modern societies face rising seas and shifting climates, the prehistoric response lingers beneath the surface of our thinking. We still move when the water comes, still rebuild farther back, still search for new routes rather than absolute safety. The tools are different, the scale is larger, but the logic is the same. The prehistoric boat and the lost port are not distant curiosities. They are early expressions of a strategy humanity has always relied on. Adapt, move, remember what works, release what no longer does. The sea continues to erase details, but it cannot erase influence. It cannot undo the fact that human beings learned, very early, to trust uncertainty more than immobility. That lesson carried us across rivers, along coasts, and eventually across oceans. It shaped where we live, how we connect, and how we survive change. And so, if this story feels unfinished, it is because it is still happening. Somewhere, someone stands near water, watching a shoreline shift, deciding whether to stay or to go. That decision links them directly to those first unnamed sailors whose boats dissolved, whose ports sank, but whose way of living quietly became the foundation of the world we now inhabit. From that point onward, the distance between past and present collapses because the pattern never truly changed. What we call modern resilience is often just ancient adaptation expressed with newer materials. Concrete replaces wood, engines replace oars, satellites replace stars, but the underlying response remains familiar. When water advances, humans reassess. When ground becomes uncertain, they reconsider attachment. The prehistoric mindset, shaped by tides rather than borders, quietly survives beneath modern planning and policy. We still negotiate with nature rather than defeat it, even when we pretend otherwise. The lost ports remind us that stability has always been temporary, and that survival has favored those who accept this without resentment. There is no tragedy in their disappearance unless permanence is assumed to be the goal. For the people who lived there, success was measured in continuity of life, not continuity of place. Their world did not end when the sea rose, it transformed. What feels like an absence to us was to them a transition. History struggles with this idea because it prefers clear endings, but human experience rarely provides them. Instead, it offers overlapping phases, gradual shifts, and quiet handovers from one way of living to another. The prehistoric boat fades from view not because it failed, but because it succeeded so completely that it became ordinary, then invisible. The lost port disappears not because it was forgotten, but because it was no longer needed. In the end, this is not a story about mystery waiting to be solved, but about perspective waiting to be adjusted. The sea did not steal this history, it simply kept it in a form that resists ownership. What remains is enough to understand the direction, even if the details are gone. Humans followed water, trusted movement, and survived change. That truth does not require monuments to endure. It is written instead into the shape of our world, the spread of our species, and the quiet knowledge that when the ground beneath us shifts, the option to move has always been and remains our oldest strength. And beyond that understanding comes a quieter realization that history measured only by what endures will always be incomplete. The prehistoric relationship with the sea teaches that endurance is not the same as importance. Some of the most influential human choices were made without witnesses and left no durable trace. A decision to cross a channel, to settle briefly on a shore, to abandon it when conditions changed, shaped lineages, languages, and migrations that still define the present. These actions were small, repeated, and practical, which is why they rarely appeared dramatic enough to be remembered. Yet repetition is how transformation truly happens. The sea offered no guarantees, only possibilities, and early humans learned to live within that uncertainty without demanding control. In doing so, they developed a flexibility that allowed them to spread, adapt, and persist through enormous environmental change. Modern society often frames uncertainty as a problem to eliminate, but prehistoric life treated it as a condition to work with. The lost ports, now submerged and silent, reflect this philosophy more clearly than any written record could. They were not abandoned in panic, but in recognition. When the water came, people moved, carrying knowledge instead of structures, relationships instead of property. That choice preserved what mattered most. Today, as coastlines shift once more and familiar ground becomes unstable, this ancient pattern quietly reasserts itself. Technology may slow the process, but it cannot cancel it. The lesson remains unchanged. Survival has always favored those who respond rather than resist. The story of prehistoric boats and lost ports does not close with discovery or proof, but with continuity. It lives on in every migration, every shoreline retreat, every decision to value movement over fixation. What was once ordinary became invisible, and what became invisible shaped everything that followed. That is why this history feels both distant and immediate at the same time. It is not behind us, it is beneath us, around us, and still unfolding, as it always has, wherever water meets land and humans decide how to live with change. Seen this way, the prehistoric world stops feeling primitive and starts feeling practical. It was not lacking knowledge, it was organized around a different priority. Instead of storing excess, it stored understanding. Instead of building upward, it built outward. The sea was not romanticized or feared, it was accounted for. Every crossing refined judgment, every loss refined caution, every success refined confidence. Over time, this created a deeply rooted maritime intuition that required no theory to function. When later societies began to record history, they mistook documentation for intelligence and permanence for progress. What came before was labeled simple because it left little behind, even though it sustained human life through immense climatic instability. The truth is that prehistoric seafaring demanded constant attention, cooperation, and restraint. A poorly timed crossing could end a lineage. A misread current could erase a group. Survival required listening rather than forcing, observing rather than conquering. These values do not translate easily into heroic narratives, which is why they faded from written memory. Yet they continued to operate beneath the surface, shaping how humans interacted with water long after ports became fortified and ships became weapons. Even today, maritime practices still carry traces of this older logic, where experience outweighs instruction and judgment outweighs technology. When technology fails, people revert to reading water, wind, and sky, drawing unknowingly on a lineage thousands of years old. The lost ports remind us that usefulness does not require visibility, and that success does not require remembrance. They existed because they worked, and they disappeared because conditions changed. No apology was owed to the future. This challenges the modern assumption that leaving a mark is a moral obligation. Prehistoric life suggests otherwise. It suggests that continuity of practice matters more than continuity of place, and that adaptation is a form of wisdom, not surrender.
As the narrative stretches forward, it becomes clear that the prehistoric boat was not merely a tool, but a way of thinking, one that accepted instability and turned it into opportunity. That way of thinking did not vanish with time. It was absorbed, diluted, forgotten, and rediscovered repeatedly. And as long as water continues to shape human choices, it will remain present, quietly guiding decisions, just as it did before history learned how to write itself down.
At this point, the story becomes less about uncovering what is missing and more about recognizing what has always been there. Prehistoric boats and lost ports do not ask to be rediscovered in full detail. They ask to be understood as part of a long human habit of responding to change without drama. Their silence is not emptiness, but restraint. They do not announce themselves because they never needed to. They existed in a world where attention was directed toward timing, balance, and cooperation rather than legacy. This is why their traces feel faint. They were not designed to outlast conditions, only to function within them. When conditions shifted, the response was not resistance, but movement. This approach allowed human communities to remain light, adaptable, and interconnected across water long before political or economic systems formalized those connections. What we inherit from this period is not a catalogue of sites, but a logic of survival that still operates whenever people face unstable ground. Even now, when technology creates the illusion of control, the underlying choice remains familiar: adapt or be overwhelmed. The prehistoric past demonstrates that adaptation does not require foresight, only attentiveness. People did not need to predict sea level rise to respond to it. They only needed to notice patterns and trust experience. This trust built a quiet confidence that carried humanity across environments that would later be considered impossible. Beyond this point, what remains is perspective rather than content, because the material record has already given everything it can. The rest must be understood through pattern and repetition. When humans repeatedly choose mobility over fixation, lightness over accumulation, and memory over monument, they reveal a consistent strategy that predates culture as we define it. The prehistoric relationship with water shows that stability was never assumed, only managed. This management did not require domination, only attentiveness. People watched tides the way later societies watched markets, adjusting behavior rather than demanding control. In doing so, they avoided collapse by refusing rigidity. The ports that vanished did not represent abandoned dreams, they represented completed functions. Once a shoreline no longer served its purpose, attachment became a liability. This logic feels uncomfortable to modern thinking, which equates success with duration. Yet duration has never been guaranteed. Even the most permanent cities exist only by negotiation with forces they cannot command. The prehistoric world simply acknowledged this openly. It did not promise continuity of place, only continuity of life. This distinction matters because it reframes disappearance as transition rather than loss. When we look at submerged landscapes today, we are tempted to mourn what is gone, but the people who left those places likely felt no such grief. They carried forward what mattered and released the rest. Their priorities were calibrated to survival, not remembrance. This is why their story feels diffuse rather than dramatic. It does not build toward a climax or collapse. It stretches, adapts, and moves on. In accepting that shape, we allow history to be broader than records and deeper than evidence.
We accept that some of the most influential human decisions were made quietly, without witnesses, and left behind only consequences rather than proof. The prehistoric boat and the lost port remain powerful, not because they can be fully recovered, but because they reveal a mode of living that has never stopped being relevant. As long as water reshapes land and humans respond, this history continues, not as a chapter to be closed, but as a condition that endures.
Eventually, even the need to explain fades, leaving only awareness that this pattern has always been ordinary. The prehistoric past does not demand recognition because it never depended on it. Its influence operates quietly, shaping instincts rather than narratives. When people today feel the urge to move away from eroding coasts, to rebuild after floods, or to seek new routes when old ones fail, they are not inventing new solutions. They are reenacting an ancient logic that predates planning and prediction. This logic accepts that environments shift faster than structures, and that survival favors those who respond early rather than those who defend too long. The lost ports illustrate this with unusual clarity. They were not abandoned because they were weak, but because they were honest about their limits. They existed for as long as conditions allowed, and then ceased without resistance. There was no expectation that the future would preserve them, because the future was expected to change. Modern societies struggle with this acceptance because they equate memory with identity and permanence with value. Prehistoric life did not make that equation. Identity moved with people, not with places, and value was measured in function rather than endurance. This difference explains why the archaeological record feels thin, while the human impact feels vast. The boats dissolved, the harbors sank, but the decisions made upon them reshaped migration, culture, and connection on a global scale. What survives is not detail, but direction. Humans followed water, adapted to its rhythms, and learned to live within uncertainty rather than attempting to erase it. That lesson did not belong to a single place or time, which is why it could survive without being written down. It passed through observation, imitation, and necessity, embedding itself into human behavior. In this sense, prehistoric seafaring is not a lost chapter, but an underlying grammar of human history. It structures how change is met and how continuity is maintained without requiring stillness. The story does not conclude with evidence or discovery, because its outcome is already visible everywhere humans live. It ends only in the realization that what feels ancient and distant is, in practice, ongoing. Water still moves, land still shifts, and humans still decide whether to stay or go. Each such decision quietly echoes those first unnamed crossings, when stepping onto water was not an act of ambition, but simply the most reasonable response to a changing world. With that realization, the narrative settles into something steady rather than dramatic, because steadiness was always its true form. The prehistoric relationship with water did not aim for mastery or legacy, it aimed for balance. Balance between risk and reward, between staying and leaving, between remembering and letting go. This balance required constant attention, not control. It trained humans to observe subtle changes, to notice when familiar patterns began to shift, and to act before crisis demanded it. Over time, this attentiveness became cultural instinct.
It shaped how communities organized themselves, how they shared knowledge, and how they understood their place in the world. Water was not separate from life, it was part of the system that defined it. Lost ports were not endpoints, but intervals, moments where movement paused long enough to matter and then continued. Their disappearance did not break continuity, it preserved it. By refusing to anchor identity to a single place, prehistoric societies ensured that identity could survive relocation. This flexibility explains how humans endured environmental changes that would later overwhelm more rigid systems. It also explains why so little physical evidence remains. What was light moved easily, what was heavy was abandoned. The sea accelerated this process, dissolving materials while carrying influence forward. Modern attempts to reconstruct this past often focus on objects, but the true legacy lies in behavior, how humans respond to uncertainty, how they weigh attachment against survival, how they treat change not as an exception, but as a rule. These responses were refined over thousands of years of living alongside water. They did not need formal expression to persist. They endured because they worked. In this way, prehistoric boats and lost ports are less about what has vanished and more about what has remained active. They represent a way of living that trusted adaptation over defense and movement over fixation. As long as coastlines shift and climates change, that way of living remains relevant. The story does not end because its subject has not disappeared. It continues quietly, each time a shoreline is reconsidered, each time a route is altered, each time people choose adjustment over denial. What began without writing continues without conclusion, carried forward not by records, but by repeated human choice in the face of moving water.
At this stage, what emerges most clearly is that prehistoric seafaring was not a phase to be surpassed, but a foundation to be reused. Each later era layered its own technologies and ambitions onto an existing relationship with water that was already mature. The difference lay not in capability, but in attitude. Where earlier societies treated water as a partner requiring respect and adjustment, later ones increasingly treated it as a problem to be solved or a resource to be controlled. This shift altered how loss was perceived. When a prehistoric port vanished, it was an expected outcome of environmental negotiation. When a later city flooded, it became a disaster because permanence had been promised. This contrast reveals why ancient drowned landscapes feel strangely calm in retrospect. There is no evidence of panic written into them, only evidence of use followed by absence. That absence is not emptiness, but completion. The function ended, so the structure ceased to matter. In a world governed by tides, meaning was always temporary. Modern observers often project tragedy onto these sites because we imagine ourselves losing what we would fight to keep. But prehistoric communities measured success differently. They invested in knowledge that could travel, not in structures that could not. This made them resilient in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to underestimate. Their choices shaped migration paths, genetic diversity, and cultural exchange on a planetary scale, all without leaving behind the kind of evidence later societies rely on to validate importance. The sea, by erasing their material traces, unintentionally preserved the purity of their strategy. What remains is not cluttered by monuments or mythologized leaders. It is a clean pattern. Observe change, respond early, move when necessary, and carry forward what cannot be replaced. This pattern does not belong to the past. It reappears whenever certainty breaks down
and adaptation becomes essential. In that sense, the prehistoric boat and the lost port are not relics waiting to be rediscovered, but references quietly consulted every time humans face unstable ground and choose movement over resistance, continuing a conversation with water that never truly paused. From here, the story thins out, not because meaning is exhausted, but because repetition has done its work. The same choices recur across centuries and coastlines, changing only in scale and context. Humans build, water responds, humans adjust. Sometimes adjustment comes early and quietly, sometimes late and painfully, but the pattern itself does not change. Prehistoric seafarers lived close enough to water to notice its warnings before they became emergencies. Later societies, buffered by technology and distance, often noticed too late. This difference explains why early movement feels deliberate, while later movement feels forced. The lost ports belonged to a world where leaving was still a valid option, not an admission of defeat. They remind us that mobility was once normal, and that attachment was conditional. As history accumulated weight in the form of property, borders, and permanence, mobility became harder, and loss became louder. Yet the ancient logic never disappeared entirely. It retreated into the background, resurfacing whenever stability proved illusory. In moments of crisis, people still prioritize what can be carried, remembered, and rebuilt. This instinct did not originate in modern disaster response. It was shaped over millennia of living with moving water. The prehistoric boat represents the earliest expression of that instinct, simple in form but profound in implication. It made distance negotiable and change survivable. The port, equally simple, provided just enough pause to make movement sustainable. When either ceased to function, neither was mourned. They were tools, not symbols. This clarity of purpose is what makes them difficult to romanticize, but easy to underestimate. Their legacy is not emotional, but practical. It lives on wherever humans adapt without spectacle, relocate without ceremony, and continue without insisting that the ground beneath them remain still. In that quiet continuation, the prehistoric past remains present, not as a memory to be recovered, but as a habit that endures, whenever water and humanity meet.
As the habit endures, it becomes clear that what we call progress has always moved alongside loss, not away from it. Every expansion across water carried both opportunity and erasure. And prehistoric people accepted this duality without trying to resolve it. They did not expect growth without cost or movement without consequence. This acceptance prevented shock when change arrived. A shoreline disappearing was not a betrayal of effort, but confirmation of what had always been known. Modern societies often experience the same events as crises because expectations have shifted, not because the events themselves are new. The sea has always behaved this way. What changed was the belief that it could be held still. The prehistoric boat did not promise safety, it offered possibility. The port did not promise permanence, it offered access. These modest promises were enough. They allowed humans to spread without needing certainty, to connect without needing control. Over time, this approach shaped a species comfortable with partial knowledge and flexible outcomes. That comfort is difficult to see in material remains, but it appears clearly in results. Humans reached distant islands, adapted to varied climates, and maintained connections across water long before centralized systems existed to manage them. None of this required dominance over the sea, only familiarity with its patterns.
The loss of prehistoric ports did not interrupt this process, it was part of it. Each disappearance refined judgment, reinforcing which places were worth returning to and which were better left behind. This quiet feedback loop guided movement more effectively than any map could. Today, when we attempt to reconstruct these worlds, we often focus on what was lost rather than what was learned. Yet the learning endured. It persists in the way humans still evaluate risk, balance attachment, and accept uncertainty when necessary. The prehistoric past speaks through these behaviors, not through objects. It reminds us that continuity does not depend on keeping everything, but on knowing what to release. As long as water continues to reshape land, this understanding remains active, guiding choices in ways that feel instinctive precisely because they are ancient, carried forward through countless crossings that left no trace except the survival of those who made them.
And in that survival lies the clearest evidence of all, stronger than artifacts or date. A strategy that persists for tens of thousands of years does not do so by accident. Prehistoric seafaring worked because it aligned human behavior with environmental reality rather than opposing it. Water was unpredictable, so plans remained flexible. Shores were temporary, so attachment stayed light. Knowledge mattered more than possessions because knowledge could move. This hierarchy of values quietly shaped social organization, encouraging cooperation over accumulation and awareness over dominance. A boat required shared effort to build and use. A crossing required trust. These conditions favored groups that could coordinate, communicate, and adapt together. The lost ports reflect this social logic. They were not centers of authority, but nodes of interaction. People gathered, exchanged, rested, and dispersed again. Their importance lay in connection, not control. When conditions changed, abandoning them did not fracture society because society was not anchored there. It flowed through people rather than structures. This fluidity explains how early human networks could stretch across vast areas without centralized power. The sea connected rather than divided because those who lived with it did not treat it as a boundary. Over time, this approach seeded patterns of exchange that later civilizations formalized but did not invent. The difference is that formality brought rigidity, and rigidity brought vulnerability. What had once been negotiable became defended. What had once been temporary became sacred. From that shift onward, loss felt catastrophic rather than expected. The prehistoric past offers a contrasting model, one in which letting go was not failure, but competence. Its traces are subtle because competence does not announce itself, it simply continues. When we struggle to find these early ports, we are not encountering absence, but restraint. They left little because little was needed. Their success is measured not in what remains, but in what followed. A species capable of living with change, crossing uncertainty, and continuing forward without demanding that the world stay still long enough to be recorded. From this point, the pattern has fully revealed itself, and what follows is its echo through time. Each era repeats the same negotiation in new language, with new tools, but under the same conditions. Water advances, recedes, reshapes, and humans respond. Sometimes the response is wise and early. sometimes delayed and costly, but the logic beneath it remains unchanged. Prehistoric people did not imagine a future that would judge them, so they did not build for approval. They built for use. When use ended, they moved on. This absence of legacy thinking allowed decisions to remain practical rather than symbolic. No port had to be defended for honor. No shoreline had to be held to preserve identity. Identity traveled with kin, with shared experience, with remembered roots. This made communities light enough to survive repeated disruption. The sea, in turn, rewarded this lightness by offering pathways instead of walls. What we now interpret as lost history was, in its own time, a complete system functioning exactly as intended. Its invisibility today is not proof of insignificance, but evidence of efficiency. Nothing extra was produced. Nothing unnecessary was preserved. As history accumulated weight through writing, ownership, and borders, this efficiency became harder to maintain. Movement slowed, attachment deepened, and loss grew louder. Yet even then, the ancient instinct never vanished. It resurfaced whenever stability failed. People still packed what mattered, remembered what worked, and searched for new ground. In those moments, the prehistoric past reasserted itself, not as memory, but as behavior. This is why the story resists a definitive ending. It does not belong to a closed era. It operates wherever humans face change without guarantees. The prehistoric boat is no longer visible, but its logic governs evacuation routes, migration patterns, and coastal retreat. The lost port is no longer named, but its principle appears wherever a place is used fully and then released. The continuity is quiet but unbroken. And in recognizing that continuity, the story finally rests, not because it has finished, but because it has said everything it needs to say in the only way it ever could, by continuing forward, just as it always has, alongside moving water and adapting lives. What remains after that is silence. Not because there is nothing left, but because silence was always part of this history. The prehistoric world did not explain itself, it functioned. Its relationship with water did not seek meaning beyond survival, and yet it produced meaning on a scale that only becomes visible much later. By living lightly, by accepting loss without drama, by trusting movement over defense, early humans created the conditions for everything that followed. The disappearance of their ports did not erase their presence, it distributed it. Their choices spread outward through descendants, routes, habits, and assumptions about how to face uncertainty. Even now, when societies debate whether to retreat or resist, whether to rebuild or relocate, they are reenacting an argument older than writing. The sea has not changed its position in that argument. It still moves according to forces beyond negotiation. What changes is how honestly humans respond. Prehistoric seafarers responded without illusion. They did not mistake temporary ground for permanent ground. They did not confuse shelter with certainty. That clarity allowed them to endure. The fact that we struggle to recover their story says more about our expectations than about their lives. We look for markers of importance that they never intended to leave. Yet their influence is undeniable, written not in ruins but in outcomes. A species capable of living on every continent, connected across oceans, accustomed to change.
The prehistoric boat and the lost port are therefore not symbols of mystery, but of competence. They represent a way of being that did not require explanation to work. As long as water continues to shape the world, that way of being remains available. The story does not end with a conclusion or a discovery, but with recognition that some histories are meant to persist without being seen, guiding behavior rather than memory. And in that sense, this history has never been lost at all. It has simply been moving, quietly, alongside us, from the first crossing to the present moment, waiting not to be found, but to be noticed.
Beyond that noticing, there is only acceptance that this kind of history does not accumulate toward revelation. It accumulates toward familiarity. The prehistoric relationship with water became so ingrained that it stopped feeling like knowledge and started feeling like common sense. People knew when to leave without needing to justify it. They knew when a place had given everything it could give. This knowledge did not require consensus or instruction. It emerged from shared experience, repeated often enough to become instinct. The sea shaped this instinct by refusing predictability. It rewarded attention and punished assumption. Over time, humans learned not to argue with it. This lesson did not disappear when writing arrived. It was simply overshadowed by louder narratives of control and expansion. Yet whenever those narratives fail, the older lesson returns intact. We see it in quiet relocations, in temporary shelters, in routes that shift without ceremony. These actions rarely enter history books, but they sustain lives all the same. The lost ports belong to this category of sustained but uncelebrated success. They did not need to be remembered to matter. Their value was exhausted in use, not in legacy. This challenges the idea that importance must be visible or enduring. Prehistoric life suggests the opposite, that what adapts best often leaves the least behind. As the story stretches forward into the present, it becomes clear that the ancient balance between movement and settlement still governs outcomes. When that balance is respected, disruption remains manageable. When it is denied, disruption becomes crisis. The prehistoric boat represents the willingness to move before being forced. The lost port represents the wisdom to let go without regret. Together, they form a quiet framework for survival that has never stopped operating. The story continues not because more can be said, but because the conditions that produced it persist. Water still shifts, land still responds, and humans still choose, again and again, whether to hold fast or to move on. Each choice renews a history that was never written down, never finished, and never truly gone. And with each renewal, the history deepens without growing louder. It does not announce itself through discovery or revelation, but through repetition so steady that it feels natural. Prehistoric seafaring was not a solution to a single problem. It was an orientation toward the world. It assumed change as the baseline and built behavior around that assumption. This orientation proved durable because it did not depend on stability to function. When shorelines shifted, routes adjusted. When resources moved, communities followed. Nothing essential was lost because nothing essential was fixed in place. This is why the archaeological record feels thin, while the human footprint feels vast. The record looks for anchors, while the past was built on flow. The sea preserved this logic by making permanence expensive and adaptability cheap. In doing so, it quietly selected for behaviors that could survive uncertainty.
Those behaviors were passed on, not as doctrines, but as habits. They did not need explanation because they were reinforced by experience. Over time, they became invisible, absorbed into how humans relate to space, risk, and change. Even today, when people speak of starting over, of moving on, of finding new ground, they echo a prehistoric vocabulary shaped by water. The lost ports are part of that vocabulary. They mark moments when staying stopped making sense and leaving became the wiser choice. There was no drama in that decision, only clarity. Modern culture often romanticizes roots, but prehistoric life understood routes. Roots tie you to one place, routes keep you alive across many. This difference explains why the past feels elusive. We search for what stayed, while the past invested in what moved. The story therefore remains open, not because it is unfinished, but because its logic is still in use. As long as humans face environments that shift faster than certainty, the prehistoric lesson remains relevant. Adapt early, move lightly, remember what works, and accept that some things are meant to disappear once they have done their work. In that acceptance, the ancient conversation between humans and water continues, unbroken, unrecorded, and quietly sufficient. Over time, this quiet sufficiency became the background condition of human life, so ordinary that it escaped notice. Prehistoric people did not frame their choices as philosophy or strategy. They framed them as necessity. Water rose, routes shifted, and life adjusted without debate. This lack of internal conflict is difficult for modern minds to grasp because modern systems are built on defending decisions long after conditions have changed. The prehistoric approach was simpler and therefore more durable. When something no longer worked, it was released. When something worked, it was repeated. There was no obligation to justify either action beyond survival itself. Lost ports illustrate this perfectly. They were not failures of planning, but evidence that planning was flexible enough to end. Their disappearance was not an erasure of meaning, but a confirmation that meaning had already been fulfilled. This perspective reframes how we understand progress. Progress was not a straight line toward permanence, but a series of successful adjustments made under changing conditions. The sea acted as a constant test, removing what could not adapt and carrying forward what could. Over generations, this produced humans who were less dependent on fixed environments and more capable of negotiating new ones. That capability is the true inheritance of prehistoric seafaring. It cannot be excavated or dated, but it can be observed in outcomes. Humans occupy coastlines, islands, and river systems across the globe. They respond to disruption by moving, reorganizing, and rebuilding. These responses feel modern, but they are ancient. The prehistoric boat was the first expression of that response, and the lost port was its natural companion. Together, they formed a system that valued timing over territory and knowledge over ownership. As long as water continues to move and land continues to shift, that system remains relevant. The story does not demand an ending because its function is not to conclude, but to persist. It lives on wherever humans face uncertainty without illusion, choose adjustment over denial, and accept that survival has never depended on holding the ground still, but on knowing when it is time to move.
What follows that persistence is a subtle shift in how the past speaks to the present, not through instruction, but through example. Prehistoric life by the water did not offer rules, only patterns, and patterns are learned by living inside them long enough. People did not debate whether to move, they sensed when staying no longer aligned with reality. This sensitivity to change was cultivated over generations, refined by small successes and quiet losses. It required paying attention rather than asserting control. The sea enforced this discipline relentlessly. Those who ignored its signals did not leave descendants to record their mistakes. Those who listened passed on their habits without ceremony. This process filtered behavior more effectively than any written code. Lost ports represent moments where that filtering worked exactly as intended. They were used fully, then left behind before attachment became dangerous. No effort was wasted preserving what no longer served life. Modern perspectives often misinterpret this as lack of ambition, but it was the opposite. It was ambition aimed at continuity rather than display. The goal was not to build something that lasted forever, but to live in a way that could endure ongoing change. This goal shaped social relationships as well. Cooperation mattered more than accumulation because mobility depended on trust. Knowledge mattered more than objects because objects could sink or rot. Memory mattered more than place because place could disappear. These priorities created societies that were light enough to survive environmental shifts that would later overwhelm heavier systems. When we search for their traces and find so little, we are encountering the success of that design, not its failure. The sea removed what was unnecessary and preserved only what could travel forward invisibly. That is why the legacy of prehistoric seafaring feels diffuse yet pervasive. It is not located in a site or an artifact, but in a way of responding to uncertainty that continues to shape human behavior. As coastlines erode and climates fluctuate, this ancient response quietly reemerges, guiding decisions that feel pragmatic rather than historical. The story continues not because it needs more detail, but because its logic remains applicable. Wherever humans choose movement over fixation, release over resistance, and adaptation over denial, they are participating in a history that began before writing and never required it to endure. As this logic continues to surface, it becomes clear that the prehistoric relationship with water was not a temporary adaptation, but a permanent layer of human thinking. It did not disappear when agriculture expanded or cities formed. It simply receded until circumstances called it back. Whenever stability proves fragile, the older logic reasserts itself with remarkable clarity. People begin to think in terms of routes instead of routes, of timing instead of ownership, of viability instead of symbolism. These shifts feel instinctive because they are. They were rehearsed long before history learned to celebrate permanence. The lost ports stand as quiet proof that letting go can be as intentional as building. They remind us that success does not require endurance beyond usefulness. In a world governed by change, usefulness is the highest form of intelligence. Prehistoric communities understood this without naming it. They lived close enough to water to recognize its authority, and flexible enough to adjust without resentment. This made their lives less visible to later historians, but more compatible with reality. What survives of them survives through effect rather than evidence. Their decisions shaped migration paths, cultural overlaps, and patterns of settlement that still define the human map. None of this required commemoration to persist. It required only repetition. Each successful response reinforced the next until adaptation itself became tradition. The prehistoric boat was not a breakthrough moment, but a repeated solution, refined through use rather than invention. The port was not a destination, but a temporary alignment of need and geography. When that alignment ended, so did the place. Nothing essential was lost. This perspective reframes disappearance as completion rather than failure. It suggests that some things are meant to exist only as long as they serve life.
In accepting this, we align more closely with how humans have always survived change. The story, therefore, does not move toward a climax or a conclusion. It settles into a rhythm, repeating wherever water reshapes land and humans respond with attentiveness instead of defiance. That rhythm began before writing and continues without needing to be recorded. It exists in the ongoing negotiation between movement and settlement, between certainty and adjustment. As long as that negotiation continues, so does this history, quiet, unmarked, and entirely sufficient. As that rhythm carries on, it reveals that prehistoric life was guided less by foresight than by responsiveness. People did not plan centuries ahead. They paid attention to what was happening now and adjusted quickly enough to stay aligned with it. This responsiveness reduced the cost of change. By moving early and lightly, they avoided the desperation that comes when options narrow. The sea favored this approach because it changed gradually but relentlessly. Those who noticed subtle shifts survived. Those who waited for certainty did not. Lost ports mark points where responsiveness succeeded. They were abandoned not at the moment of catastrophe, but at the moment when staying stopped being sensible. This distinction matters. It shows a culture that valued timing over endurance. Modern societies often delay action in pursuit of stability, while prehistoric societies accepted instability as a constant and acted within it. This acceptance created a calm pragmatism that does not translate easily into heroic stories. There are no last stands in this history, no dramatic defenses, only continuous adjustment. That is why the past feels quiet. Its most important decisions were made without spectacle. Yet these decisions accumulated into outcomes far larger than any single event. Humanity spread, diversified, and connected across water because this approach worked repeatedly. The prehistoric boat was effective not because it was advanced, but because it matched reality. The port was useful not because it was permanent, but because it existed at the right moment. When that moment passed, disappearance was not loss, but alignment. This way of living trained humans to measure success by continuity rather than dominance. It did not promise control, only survival. And survival, repeated long enough, became expansion. The influence of this logic can still be seen wherever people choose flexibility over fixation, wherever they treat place as conditional rather than absolute. In those choices, the prehistoric past remains active, not as memory or myth, but as an inherited sense of when to stay, when to move, and when to let water decide the shape of the next step. With each such decision, the ancient pattern reinforces itself without needing acknowledgement. It does not require belief, only participation. Prehistoric humans did not conceptualize resilience, they practiced it. Their relationship with water trained them to remain alert to gradual change, to respect forces beyond negotiation, and to respond before pressure turned into crisis. This training did not end when one port was left behind or one route was altered. It accumulated quietly in shared behavior. Over time, these behaviors formed a baseline expectation that the world would not stay still and that survival depended on moving with it rather than against it. The sea was the constant reminder of this truth. It erased mistakes gently and relentlessly, offering no exceptions. Lost ports therefore represent successful timing rather than defeat. They show that people left before attachment became a liability. In doing so, they preserved continuity at the cost of permanence, a trade they understood well. Modern thinking often reverses this trade, choosing permanence even when continuity is threatened. That reversal explains why loss feels sharper now than it did then. Prehistoric life avoided that sharpness by refusing to invest identity in immovable things. Identity traveled with people, with skills, with shared memory. This made adaptation less painful and movement less disruptive. The absence of monumental remains is not evidence of fragility, but of efficiency. Nothing unnecessary was carried forward. The sea completed the process by dissolving what was no longer relevant. What could not dissolve was behavior. That survived because it lived in people rather than objects. Even today, when humans face uncertain ground, the same calculus emerges instinctively. What can be moved is prioritized. What cannot is reconsidered. This instinct feels personal, but it is collective, inherited from countless quiet adjustments made long before history was written. The prehistoric boat and the lost port were early expressions of this inheritance, not exceptional moments, but normal ones. Their story continues not through discovery, but through repetition, each time humans choose responsiveness over resistance and allow change to shape the next step forward.
As this inheritance continues to express itself, it becomes clear that the prehistoric world did not separate survival from understanding. To survive was to understand change well enough to move with it. Water enforced this lesson with consistency. It never needed to hurry, and it never needed to explain. It simply shifted, and those who lived beside it learned to shift as well. Over time, this created a population attuned not to stability, but to signals. Small changes mattered: a different tide, a new current, a shoreline that no longer returned to its old shape. These were not warnings of disaster, but information. Acting on that information early preserved choice. Lost ports are evidence of choices preserved. They show that people left while options were still open. This is why their disappearance lacks drama. Drama appears when choice has already narrowed. Prehistoric movement aimed to avoid that moment. It was preventive rather than reactive. Modern societies often celebrate reaction as strength, but prehistoric life valued anticipation. This difference shaped everything from settlement size to social bonds. Communities remained small enough to move, connected enough to cooperate, and flexible enough to reorganize quickly. The sea rewarded this scale. Large, rigid systems broke. Small, adaptive ones flowed around obstacles. This pattern repeated across coasts and generations until it became ordinary. When writing later froze moments into records, it captured outcomes but missed processes. The processes were already complete. They had done their work and moved on. What remained was a world quietly shaped by countless adjustments no one thought to record. That world is the one we inherited. Its coastlines, its population spread, its cultural overlaps all reflect decisions made without monuments or archives. The prehistoric boat and the lost port were not symbols meant to last. They were tools meant to work. Their success is visible not in their remains, but in the continuity of human presence everywhere water allows life. As long as humans continue to face environments that change faster than certainty, this ancient responsiveness remains relevant. It does not demand attention. It simply waits to be used again, as it always has, whenever movement becomes the clearest answer. And when movement becomes the answer, it rarely announces itself as history in the making. It feels ordinary, even mundane, because that is how this logic survives. Prehistoric people did not need to feel exceptional to act effectively. They trusted patterns proven by repetition rather than promises of permanence. Water ensured that trust stayed grounded. It punished overconfidence without malice and rewarded attentiveness without praise. Over generations, this produced a quiet confidence that did not rely on structures or claims. Life was organized around conditions, not ideals. A port existed because it worked. A route existed because it remained open. When either stopped aligning with reality, it was released without resentment. This lack of attachment reduced conflict with the environment and with each other.
Energy was not spent defending what could no longer be defended. It was redirected toward finding the next viable alignment. This mindset explains why prehistoric expansion did not require conquest in its earliest forms. Movement replaced domination as the primary response to limitation. The sea made this possible by offering connection without ownership. It could be crossed but not possessed. That distinction shaped human behavior profoundly. Instead of walls, there were timings. Instead of borders, there were currents. Instead of centers, there were networks. Lost ports were nodes in those networks, meaningful while active and irrelevant once abandoned. Their disappearance did not weaken the network, it refined it. Each abandonment clarified which routes still mattered and which no longer did. This constant refinement kept the system efficient and resilient. When later societies attempted to fix these networks into permanent hubs, they often inherited the roots without understanding the flexibility that made them work. That misunderstanding led to cycles of overbuilding and collapse. Prehistoric systems avoided those cycles by never expecting stillness. They accepted change as neutral rather than hostile. This acceptance reduced fear and increased adaptability. Even now, when people instinctively sense that a place or situation has reached its limit, they are drawing on this ancient calibration. The feeling does not come from theory, but from inheritance. It is the echo of countless earlier decisions where leaving was not a failure, but the correct continuation of life.
That echo persists because it was never tied to a single era or technology. It belongs to a deeper layer of human behavior that activates whenever certainty dissolves. Prehistoric people did not experience this activation as anxiety. It was simply awareness sharpening. The environment spoke through patterns, and humans responded through adjustment. There was no expectation that land owed them stability. That expectation emerged much later. Early coastal life assumed negotiation rather than entitlement. The sea was a partner only in the sense that it could be read, not controlled. This reading required patience, humility, and collective memory. Knowledge was shared through demonstration rather than instruction, through watching when others left and understanding why without needing explanation. Lost ports were teaching moments without teachers. Their emptiness communicated that staying too long was unnecessary and risky. Children grew up seeing places appear and disappear, learning that disappearance was not erasure, but transition. This normalized impermanence and reduced fear of change. Modern cultures often treat abandonment as trauma, but prehistoric life treated it as rhythm. That difference explains much of the psychological distance we feel from the deep past. We search for origins that stand still, while they lived inside cycles that moved. The prehistoric boat was not a symbol of exploration. It was a continuation of walking, extended onto water. The port was not a claim, it was a pause. Both existed within a mindset that measured success by alignment rather than duration. When alignment ended, movement resumed. This mindset allowed humans to occupy unstable edges of the world without collapsing under their volatility. Coasts, deltas, estuaries, and islands became livable not because they were safe, but because people were ready to leave them. Safety was not located in place, but in readiness. That readiness is the true inheritance of prehistoric seafaring. It cannot be mapped archaeologically, but it can be felt whenever humans choose flexibility over fixation. As environmental pressures increase and certainty continues to erode, this inheritance becomes more visible again, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. The ancient pattern does not return as a story to be remembered, but as a behavior to be repeated. In that repetition, the prehistoric boat keeps moving, the port keeps dissolving, and the quiet history of adaptation continues,
uninterrupted, from the first shoreline to the present moment.
From this point onward, the pattern no longer needs reinforcement because it has already proven itself across time. Prehistoric humans did not wait for collapse to justify movement. They moved at the first signs of misalignment. This created a margin of safety that later civilizations often lost by insisting on permanence. The sea taught that margins matter more than monuments. A little space to adapt, a little time to respond, was worth more than any structure built to resist change. Lost ports illustrate this margin perfectly. They were not abandoned in desperation, but in confidence. Confidence that another place would work, that knowledge could travel, that life did not depend on one fixed location. This confidence was earned through repetition, not belief. Each successful relocation reinforced trust in movement itself. Over generations, this trust became invisible, embedded in how humans assessed risk and opportunity. When conditions shifted, movement felt reasonable rather than frightening. This is why prehistoric societies could occupy liminal spaces that later societies struggled to hold. They did not confuse presence with possession. Being somewhere did not require owning it forever. The sea reinforced this lesson by remaining fundamentally unownable. You could cross it, use it, read it, but never claim it. This shaped a worldview where access mattered more than control. Routes mattered more than borders. Timing mattered more than strength. These priorities reduced conflict with natural forces and redirected energy toward coordination and awareness. Even social hierarchies remained relatively fluid because survival depended on cooperation during movement. Leadership was situational, emerging when needed and dissolving when conditions changed. This flexibility made societies harder to trace archaeologically, but easier to sustain biologically. What endured was not the structure, but the species. As modern observers, we often mistake visibility for importance, but prehistoric history reminds us that effectiveness does not require display. The most successful systems are often the least visible because they do not need to announce themselves. They simply work and then move on. In this sense, the prehistoric boat and the lost port represent a complete logic of living with change, not a beginning or an end. They form a loop that continues to operate wherever humans face environments that refuse to stay still. The history does not progress toward resolution because resolution was never the goal. Continuity was. And continuity, maintained through countless quiet decisions to move early, let go easily, and trust adaptability, remains the most enduring achievement of the prehistoric world. Beyond continuity, there is only refinement. Prehistoric adaptation did not evolve toward complexity for its own sake. It evolved toward efficiency. Anything that slowed response or increased dependency was gradually discarded. This is why material culture remained minimal, while behavioral intelligence expanded. Tools were simple because situations changed too often to justify excess. Knowledge was prioritized because it could be carried without weight. Water enforced this economy of survival. It rewarded those who traveled light and punished those who mistook accumulation for security. Lost ports reflect this refinement clearly. They show restraint as much as capability. The ability to build did not automatically lead to the desire to stay. Leaving required discipline, not weakness. It required resisting the comfort of familiarity in favor of long-term viability. This discipline was social as well as environmental. Groups learned to coordinate departures, to dissolve routines, to accept disruption as part of life rather than a failure of it. Children grew up watching elders make these decisions calmly, absorbing the lesson that change was normal and manageable.
This normalized uncertainty in a way that later, more rigid societies struggled to replicate. When rigidity entered human systems, it often did so alongside claims of control over land and water. Those claims introduced conflict because water does not respect ownership. Prehistoric life avoided this conflict by never attempting it. The sea was engaged with pragmatically, not ideologically. Routes were followed because they worked, not because they belonged to anyone. Ports existed because conditions aligned, not because they were defended. This absence of entitlement reduced friction with the environment and allowed humans to exploit dynamic spaces sustainably. Over time, these practices shaped migration on a planetary scale. Islands were reached, continents connected, cultures overlapped, all without centralized planning. The mechanism was simple. Notice change early, move before pressure mounts, and carry only what remains useful. This mechanism required no record-keeping to function. It operated through shared expectation. That expectation still surfaces today whenever people intuitively sense that a situation has run its course. The feeling is ancient. It does not announce itself as history, but it carries history within it. In that sense, the prehistoric past is not behind us. It is embedded in how humans still respond when the ground shifts, the water rises, and certainty begins to dissolve.
At this stage, the pattern reaches a kind of quiet completeness, not by stopping, but by becoming indistinguishable from ordinary decision-making. Prehistoric people did not experience their lives as part of a grand narrative of adaptation. They experienced them as a sequence of practical responses to immediate conditions. That practicality is what allowed the pattern to persist without distortion. Nothing was exaggerated, nothing was romanticized, and nothing needed to be remembered beyond its usefulness. Water ensured this honesty by removing illusions quickly. It did not allow stories of permanence to survive untested. When land shifted or access changed, reality corrected expectation. Lost ports are the physical residue of that correction. They show where expectation once aligned with reality and then stopped. The response was not denial, but departure. This responsiveness prevented the buildup of catastrophic failure. Instead of collapse, there was transition. Instead of crisis, there was movement. This is why the prehistoric record feels sparse at the points where modern history expects drama. The drama never accumulated. Pressure was released early and often. Over time, this created a species remarkably tolerant of uncertainty. Humans became capable of living with provisional answers, temporary solutions, and shifting plans. This tolerance is not accidental, it is inherited. It was shaped by thousands of years of living alongside water that refused to stay still. The prehistoric boat and the lost port are simply the most visible expressions of this inheritance, but the inheritance itself is internal. It lives in judgment, timing, and restraint. It appears whenever people choose to adapt before being forced, to move before being trapped, to release before loss turns painful. Modern technologies may change the scale of movement, but they do not change the underlying logic. The same calculus still applies. What works now, what is changing, and when staying becomes riskier than leaving. In this sense, prehistoric history does not sit behind us as a closed chapter. It operates ahead of us as a set of default responses waiting to be activated. Whenever certainty weakens and environments shift, the ancient pattern surfaces again, not as memory, but as instinct,
guiding human behavior with the same quiet efficiency that once carried the first boats away from the shore and allowed the ports they left behind to disappear without regret.
From here, the story no longer expands outward, but settles inward, into the way humans interpret choice itself. Prehistoric life near water trained people to accept that not every decision needed justification beyond its effectiveness. If something sustained life, it was correct. If it stopped doing so, it was released. This stripped decision-making of ego and reduced attachment to outcome. There was no concept of failure tied to departure. Leaving was not an admission of error, but recognition of change. Water made this recognition unavoidable. It blurred boundaries, erased edges, and reminded people that the world was not fixed for their convenience. Lost ports embody this lesson with remarkable clarity. They were not abandoned because people lacked skill, but because they had enough skill to know when continuation was no longer efficient. This kind of judgment cannot be rushed or dramatized. It develops slowly, through repeated exposure to uncertainty handled without panic. Over generations, it produced a calm relationship with risk. Risk was not something to eliminate, only something to manage through awareness and mobility. The prehistoric boat was an extension of this mindset. It did not promise safety, it offered options. Options mattered more than security, because security could vanish overnight. Options preserved agency. This distinction shaped human expansion more than any single invention. People moved not because they sought conquest or novelty, but because movement preserved choice. Even when later societies layered meaning, identity, and power onto land and water, the older logic never disappeared entirely. It remained dormant, reactivating whenever fixed systems proved brittle. That is why periods of disruption often feel strangely familiar across cultures and eras. The same responses emerge: downsizing, relocation, reorganization, improvisation. These are not modern inventions, they are inherited behaviors, refined long before writing. The prehistoric past speaks through them without needing recognition. Its voice is practical, not symbolic. It asks only one question: does this still work? When the answer becomes unclear, movement resumes. In this way, the story does not conclude with an ending, discovery, or moral. It resolves into a method for living with uncertainty that predates history and outlasts it. As long as humans continue to face environments shaped by forces beyond control, this method remains relevant. The boat keeps offering passage, the port keeps dissolving when its time is done, and the quiet intelligence that guided the first crossings continues to shape human survival, not as a legend remembered, but as a habit repeated. After that, the method becomes so embedded that it no longer feels like a response to the environment, but a baseline expectation of life. Prehistoric humans did not separate nature from decision-making. Nature was the condition within which decisions occurred. Water did not interrupt life, it structured it. Tides, seasons, currents, and erosion provided a moving framework that trained attention and disciplined expectation. People learned not to demand consistency from the world, because consistency was never offered. This prevented disappointment from hardening into resistance. Lost ports reflect this emotional economy as much as a practical one. They show a refusal to mourn what had simply completed its function. There were no rituals of regret for places left behind, because value was never measured by duration. Value was measured by contribution. When contribution ended, attachment dissolved.
This freed energy for future alignment instead of past defense. Over time, this created cultures skilled at transition rather than preservation. Preservation was reserved for knowledge, relationships, and practices that could travel. Everything else remained provisional. The prehistoric boat was designed within this logic. It was not meant to last forever. It was meant to carry life across a moment of instability. Once that moment passed, repair or replacement was expected. Nothing was sacred except continuity itself. This explains why early maritime cultures could absorb loss without collapse. Storms destroyed vessels, coasts vanished, routes shifted, yet the system persisted because it was not invested in any single expression of itself. It was invested in function. Modern observers often misread this as fragility, but it was the opposite. Fragility emerges when systems depend on specific outcomes. Prehistoric systems depended only on responsiveness. That dependency proved resilient across millennia. Even today, when infrastructures fail and plans dissolved, the same ancient behaviors resurface beneath modern language. People simplify, coordinate locally, move resources, abandon what no longer serves. These actions feel improvised, but they are deeply familiar to the species. They're not learned in crisis, they are remembered through instinct. In this way, the prehistoric relationship with water continues to inform human survival without ever announcing itself. It operates quietly, shaping judgment, reducing panic, and restoring mobility when certainty breaks down. The story continues not by adding events, but by repeating its logic wherever humans face a world that refuses to stay still.
Eventually, even the idea of continuation dissolves because nothing new needs to be added for the pattern to function. Prehistoric humans did not seek completeness, they accepted adequacy. Life did not need to be perfected, only sustained. Water reinforced this acceptance by never offering final solutions. Every shoreline was temporary, every route conditional, every advantage reversible. This prevented the illusion that success could be locked in permanently. Lost ports are the quiet acknowledgement of that reality. They show where adequacy was achieved and then released without ceremony. No effort was spent trying to freeze a moment that had already passed. This restraint protected communities from overcommitment and from the false security of sunk costs. Modern systems often collapse under the weight of what they refuse to abandon. Prehistoric systems avoided that weight by remaining light. Lightness was not poverty, it was strategic. It allowed rapid response, reduced vulnerability, and preserved optionality. The prehistoric boat embodied this principle perfectly. It carried just enough to cross uncertainty, nothing more. Its purpose was not comfort, but passage. Comfort could wait, passage could not. This hierarchy of needs shaped human psychology in ways that remain visible. When conditions worsen, people instinctively prioritize mobility, information, and cooperation. Excess is shed. Identity becomes portable. These reactions feel urgent, but also strangely clear. That clarity is inherited. It comes from a long history of living where clarity mattered more than certainty. The sea demanded that kind of clarity repeatedly until it became normal.
Over thousands of years, this normalization produced a species unusually capable of surviving disruption, not because it mastered the environment, but because it learned not to argue with it. The prehistoric relationship with water was not romantic or spiritual by default. It was practical. Meaning emerged afterward, if at all. What mattered in the moment was alignment. The moment alignment ended, movement followed. This simple rule required no enforcement because reality enforced it. The disappearance of ports, the decay of boats, the shifting of routes were not failures to be corrected, but signals to be read. Reading them accurately kept life going. That skill, more than any artifact, is the true legacy of prehistoric seafaring. It cannot be displayed in a museum or summarized in a date range, but it continues to operate whenever humans face conditions they cannot stabilize. In those moments, the ancient logic surfaces quietly, guiding action without instruction. The boat moves again, the port dissolves again, and the deep, unrecorded history of adaptation continues to do what it has always done best: sustain life without needing to be remembered.
At this point, the story no longer advances in time, but in depth. What prehistoric life reveals most clearly is not a sequence of events, but a calibration of expectations. Humans learned very early that the world does not stabilize around intention. Water made that lesson unavoidable. It flowed regardless of desire, erased regardless of effort, and connected regardless of borders. Living alongside it trained humans to expect variability and to organize life around that expectation rather than against it. Lost ports are the physical imprint of this calibration. They show that settlement was conditional from the beginning. Place was useful, not sacred. When usefulness ended, so did attachment. This did not diminish meaning, it prevented meaning from becoming a liability. Prehistoric cultures were not devoid of emotion or memory, but they placed those things where they could travel. Stories moved with people, skills moved with people, relationships moved with people. Ground did not. This made loss survivable. It also made expansion possible. The prehistoric boat was the tool that extended this logic beyond land, allowing humans to treat water not as a barrier, but as a variable surface. This shift did not require domination of the sea, only respect for its behavior. Boats were shaped by what water allowed, not by what humans demanded. This humility produced effectiveness. Over generations, effectiveness compounded. Humans crossed distances that later observers would consider dangerous or irrational, not because they were fearless, but because they were prepared to change course, turn back, or land elsewhere. Preparedness replaced bravado. That trait rarely leaves dramatic evidence, but it leaves lasting results. Humanity's global distribution is one such result. When we look at maps and wonder how people reached distant islands or remote coasts, we are seeing the outcome of countless small decisions made with this calibration in mind. Decisions that prioritized alignment over ambition and timing over triumph. The story of prehistoric boats and lost ports is therefore not about mystery or disappearance. It is about competence so refined that it left little behind. As modern conditions grow more unstable, this competence becomes easier to recognize, not because we uncover new artifacts, but because we rediscover the same behavioral solutions. The past does not instruct us through words, it resonates through action.
Each time humans choose to move lightly, respond early, and accept change without drama, they are continuing a story that began before history learned to record itself, and that has never truly stopped unfolding. What comes after that is not another layer of explanation, but a return to simplicity. Prehistoric life did not seek to outthink the world. It learned to stay in step with it. Water ensured that this step could never become rigid. Every generation encountered slightly different conditions, and each adjusted without treating difference as a crisis. This prevented nostalgia from becoming a trap. There was no ideal past to restore, only a present to read accurately. Lost ports are evidence of this refusal to romanticize what had already passed. They were not ruins in the minds of those who left them, they were finished chapters. Nothing demanded preservation once usefulness ended. This attitude preserved clarity. It kept attention focused forward, where alignment could still be found. The prehistoric boat existed for the same reason. It was not an emblem of progress, but a response to immediate need. When the need changed, so did the response. This kept human systems agile enough to absorb shock without collapsing. Over time, agility itself became the most valuable trait. Not strength, not permanence, not dominance, but the ability to adjust before damage accumulated. That ability carried humans across ice ages, shifting coastlines, and unfamiliar waters. It did so quietly, without leaving many signs behind. That absence is often mistaken for ignorance or primitivism, but it is better understood as precision. Nothing extraneous was carried forward. What mattered traveled in behavior, not in stone. As modern societies confront accelerating change, the prehistoric pattern feels less distant and more instructive, even if it arrives without labels. Downsizing, relocation, temporary solutions, modular thinking, these are not inventions of crisis, but reactivations of an older intelligence. The story of the prehistoric boat and the lost port does not end with a discovery or a moral. It resolves into a steady principle. Survival favors those who move early, hold lightly, and read reality without illusion. That principle does not age. It does not belong to one era. It simply breaks beneath the surface, ready to guide action whenever certainty erodes. In that sense, this epic has already said everything it needs to say. It does not continue by adding more words, but by continuing to work, silently, repeatedly, wherever humans meet water, change, and the decision of when it is time to move. Even after everything has been said, the pattern allows itself to be restated in another form, not because it has changed, but because repetition is how it stays alive. Prehistoric humans did not fear repetition. Seasons repeated, tides repeated, migrations repeated, and within that repetition, subtle variation was noticed and acted upon. This trained perception more than theory ever could. Living with water meant living inside a moving loop where nothing was entirely new and nothing was ever the same. Lost ports sit inside that loop as quiet markers of timing. They indicate moments when repetition broke just enough to require a new response. The response was not innovation for its own sake, but recalibration. Move a little earlier, settle a little higher, follow a different current. These small adjustments accumulated into large outcomes over long spans of time. That accumulation did not need memory to function, it only needed attention. Attention was the true currency of prehistoric survival. Attention to wind, to color of water, to sound of waves against unfamiliar ground. Boats extended attention forward, allowing humans to test uncertainty without committing fully to it. Ports concentrated attention temporarily, gathering resources and people only as long as conditions justified it. When attention signaled misalignment, withdrawal followed naturally. There was no shame in that withdrawal because it was expected. Expectation shapes emotion. Prehistoric expectations were calibrated to change, so change did not feel like betrayal. Modern expectations often assume stability, so change feels violent even when it is gradual. This difference explains why ancient adaptation appears effortless in hindsight. It was not effortless, but it was emotionally efficient. Energy was not wasted resisting what could not be controlled. It was invested in noticing what could be done next. That investment paid off repeatedly across landscapes and oceans until humanity became what it is today, widespread, varied, and capable of starting over. The prehistoric boat and the lost port are not endpoints in that process. They are recurring tools, appearing wherever humans encounter thresholds between what still works and what no longer does. Each appearance renews the same logic without fanfare. Read the conditions, act early, carry forward what matters, release what does not. This is why the story can always continue and never truly end. It is not a sequence moving toward closure, but a circuit that activates whenever needed. As long as water continues to move and humans continue to live beside it, the circuit remains intact, quietly guiding choices without asking to be named, remembered, or admired.
And so the circuit completes itself only to begin again, because beginnings and endings were never separate in this way of living. Prehistoric humans did not divide time into eras of rise and fall. They experienced it as flow. Water taught that flow was the default state of existence. To live well was not to interrupt it, but to stay aligned with it. Every shoreline was a conversation, every crossing a question asked of conditions rather than a fate. Lost ports were answers given without words. They said, "This worked, and now it does not." That answer was enough. No monument was required to validate it. Validation came from continuity, from arriving somewhere else and living again. This created a deep confidence in process rather than outcome. Outcomes were temporary by definition. Process endured. The prehistoric boat belonged to that process. It was rebuilt, repaired, reshaped, and replaced countless times, not because earlier versions failed, but because change demanded adjustment. There was no original design to preserve, only a function to maintain. This prevented stagnation. Knowledge stayed flexible because it was tied to conditions, not to tradition for its own sake. Tradition itself was adaptive, open to revision whenever reality shifted. This openness reduced the cost of being wrong. If a route failed, another was tried. If a site flooded, another was found. Error did not accumulate into disaster because correction happened early. The sea rewarded this humility repeatedly, allowing humans to explore edges of habitability without being destroyed by them.
Over time, these explorations stitched the world together, not through conquest, but through repeated alignment with what water made possible. When we look at ancient coastlines now submerged, we often speak of loss, but for the people who left them, there was no tragedy. There was simply continuation elsewhere. That perspective changes how history itself appears. History becomes less about what vanished and more about what persisted through movement. What persisted was not a place, but a way of responding. That response still lives wherever humans choose not to anchor identity to what cannot be held. It surfaces when people accept impermanence without despair and treat change as information rather than threat. In those moments, the prehistoric world is not distant at all. It is active. The boat is already in the water. The port is already provisional. And the decision, as it always has been, is not whether change will come, but whether it will be met early, lightly, and without illusion.
Beyond that decision lies the clearest expression of prehistoric intelligence: restraint. Not every possibility was pursued. Not every coast was claimed. Not every advantage was exploited to exhaustion. Living with water taught limits without moralizing them. Limits were simply facts to be worked within. This prevented overreach long before overreach became dangerous. Lost ports show restraint in action. They mark places where people could have stayed longer but chose not to, sensing that extension would convert benefit into risk. This choice preserved flexibility. Flexibility preserved life. Over time, this created a species accustomed to walking away before conditions hardened into threat. That habit is rare in systems built around permanence, but it was normal in systems built around flow. The prehistoric boat was not an instrument of ambition, it was an instrument of moderation. It allowed reach without entrapment. You could go far, but you were never obligated to stay. This balance between access and exit defined early seafaring. It reduced fear because retreat was always assumed to be valid. Modern narratives often frame retreat as failure, but prehistoric life treated it as information processed correctly. This difference reshaped emotional responses to uncertainty. Anxiety diminished when departure was acceptable. Curiosity increased when return was possible. These emotional calibrations mattered as much as tools. They made exploration sustainable rather than reckless. Over generations, sustainable exploration produced stable expansion. Humans did not rush blindly across the world. They flowed into it gradually, adjusting with each shift in condition. This is why prehistoric movement left few scars. It did not impose rigid systems that later had to break. It adapted continuously. When later civilizations attempted to fix what had once been fluid, instability followed. The contrast reveals the strength of the older approach. It was not naive, it was disciplined. Discipline expressed not through control, but through timing. Knowing when to stop building, knowing when to stop staying, knowing when to move without waiting for permission from certainty. This knowledge did not require language to persist. It lived in shared expectation and repeated behavior. Even now, when people sense that persistence itself has become dangerous, they are touching this ancient discipline. The feeling is quiet, often resisted, but unmistakable. It says, this phase is complete. Movement is not loss. It is continuation. In listening to that signal, humans are not inventing something new. They are re-entering a circuit as old as the first shoreline settlement, a circuit that has never broken, only faded from view when conditions allowed stillness, and returned to clarity when stillness became illusion.
After restraint comes fluency, the stage where responding to change no longer feels like effort at all. Prehistoric humans reached this fluency through constant exposure to environments that refused to settle. Water trained them until adjustment became automatic. Decisions were not weighed endlessly, they were felt, then acted upon. This reduced hesitation, which is often more dangerous than ignorance. Lost ports show fluency rather than indecision. They were exited cleanly, without prolonged decline, because people recognized the signal early and trusted their reading of it. Trust mattered. Trust and shared knowledge, in collective timing, in the fact that moving had worked before and would work again. This trust replaced dependence on guarantees. Guarantees did not exist. The prehistoric boat functioned inside this trust. It was not a gamble, it was a tested response. Every launch carried memory, not hope. Memory of currents learned, of distances survived, of landfalls found. That memory did not belong to individuals alone. It was distributed across the group, reinforced through repetition. This made failure survivable. If one attempt failed, the knowledge returned even if the object did not. Boats could sink, routes could vanish, knowledge endured. This inversion of value explains why material remains are scarce, while human presence is vast. Presence was the goal. Objects were temporary. Over time, this logic shaped a worldview where identity was mobile and belonging was conditional. Belonging followed people, not places. This allowed communities to remain intact even as locations changed. Social continuity did not depend on geography. It depended on coordination. Water, by disrupting geography, forced coordination to become primary. This is why prehistoric societies could dissolve and reform without fracturing. They were not anchored to fixed arrangements. They were anchored to process. Process survived change. Place did not. As modern observers, we often search for origins and locations, but prehistoric history teaches that origins can be procedural. They exist in how choices are made, not where they are made. The prehistoric boat and the lost port are procedural artifacts. They show how humans learned to stay functional inside instability. That learning did not end. It simply receded during periods when environments allowed stillness. When those periods end, the learning resurfaces intact. People begin to simplify, to prioritize movement, to accept temporary solutions without shame. These behaviors feel intuitive because they are ancient. They have been rehearsed far longer than any system of permanence. In this way, the epic does not conclude with resolution or closure. It stabilizes into a capability to live without guarantees, to move without panic, and to release without regret. As long as water continues to move, and humans continue to live alongside it, that capability remains active, quietly guiding survival the same way it always has, not through instruction or memory, but through use.
And once fluency settles in, history stops feeling like something that happens and starts feeling like something that is inhabited. Prehistoric humans did not experience themselves as standing at the edge of an unknown future. They experienced themselves inside a moving present. Water ensured that this present never froze into certainty. Every day required small recalibrations, and those recalibrations accumulated into a steady competence. This competence did not announce itself. It did not produce doctrines or blueprints. It produced timing. Knowing when to leave mattered more than knowing where to go. Lost ports reflect this perfectly. They are evidence of timing honored rather than territory defended. People did not wait for collapse to validate departure. They left when balance tipped, when effort outweighed return, when adaptation became easier than persistence. This sensitivity to balance was learned slowly and reinforced constantly. It depended on paying attention without urgency and acting without delay. The prehistoric boat existed to serve this balance. It was neither an escape nor an invasion tool. It was an extension of walking, a way to keep balance when land no longer offered it. Its design reflected compromise rather than optimization. It did not seek speed at the cost of control, or capacity at the cost of maneuverability. It was shaped by what allowed return as much as what allowed departure. This dual orientation reduced risk. Movement was never absolute. There was always the option to turn back, to reroute, to pause elsewhere.
That optionality preserved calm. Calm preserved judgment. Judgment preserved continuity. Over generations, this chain of effects shaped a species comfortable with provisional answers. Humans became capable of living without final plans, without permanent solutions, without guarantees. This capability is easy to overlook because it leaves little trace. It does not build monuments, it builds survivability. When we excavate ancient shorelines and find only fragments, we are not seeing absence, we are seeing restraint made material. The past did not invest in what could not be carried forward. It invested in behavior. That behavior remains operational. It surfaces whenever humans simplify instead of escalate, relocate instead of fortify, adapt instead of insist. These choices feel practical, not historical, because history did not frame them. Water framed them. The prehistoric world trusted water enough to learn from it, not enough to surrender to it. That balance still defines effective response today. As environments shift and certainties erode, the old fluency returns quietly. People begin to recognize when a phase has ended without needing proof. They begin to accept impermanence without collapse. They begin to move before being forced. In doing so, they are not repeating a story they remember. They are continuing a process they never stopped inheriting. The boat moves, the port dissolves, and the long, unbroken practice of living with change carries on, not toward an ending, but toward the next alignment, as it always has.
At that next alignment, nothing announces itself as new, because novelty was never the point. Prehistoric life did not chase transformation, it practiced adjustment. Adjustment kept effort proportional to conditions and prevented extremes from accumulating. Water enforced proportionality relentlessly. It responded to excess with erosion and to neglect with encroachment. Living beside it trained humans to notice when effort exceeded return and to step back before imbalance hardened into damage. Lost ports are proportional decisions made visible. They show restraint exercised at the right moment, not too early to waste opportunity, and not too late to invite loss. This timing was not calculated mathematically, it was sensed collectively. Groups developed a shared feel for when staying no longer aligned with reality. That shared sense reduced conflict because departure was understood as necessary rather than controversial. Consensus emerged from observation, not argument. The prehistoric boat supported this consensus by keeping alternatives open. It meant that leaving did not equal rupture. Relationships could persist across distance. Knowledge could circulate. Identity could remain intact while location changed. This reduced the emotional cost of movement and made adaptation socially sustainable. Over time, this social sustainability mattered as much as environmental fit. Groups that could move together endured. Groups that fractured under change did not. The sea selected quietly for coordination, patience, and trust. These traits rarely fossilize, but they shape outcomes decisively. Humanity's spread across water-bound landscapes reflects their success. When modern observers look for reasons in technology alone, they miss this deeper layer. Boats mattered, but the willingness to leave mattered more. Ports existed, but the readiness to abandon them mattered more still. This readiness prevented stagnation and avoided catastrophic collapse. Instead of dramatic endings, there were transitions. Instead of ruins, there were absences. Those absences are often misread as loss, but they are better understood as signs that the system worked. The system did not aim to leave traces, it aimed to continue. Even now, when people face conditions that no longer justify persistence, the same ancient calculus reappears beneath contemporary language. Simplify, reduce exposure, keep options open, move while movement is still possible. These responses feel rational because they are deeply familiar to the species. They do not come from theory or tradition alone. They come from a long intimacy with change. The prehistoric relationship with water cultivated that intimacy patiently, over thousands of small decisions made without record or recognition. Those decisions did not add up to a monument, they added up to survivability. And survivability, repeated across generations, became expansion, diversity, and continuity. That continuity does not need an ending to validate it. It remains active wherever humans accept that nothing essential depends on stillness, that usefulness matters more than permanence, and that leaving, done early and lightly, is not the opposite of success, but one of its oldest forms.
Beyond usefulness, the pattern finally strips itself of explanation altogether. Prehistoric humans did not require narratives to justify why they lived as they did. They did not frame their actions as wisdom or adaptation. They simply responded. Water removed the need for interpretation by making consequences immediate and visible. A shoreline shifted, a channel silted, a storm altered access, and the response followed. Lost ports were not discussed as losses because they were not experienced as such. They were completed functions. This completion freed attention for what came next. Attention was always forward-facing, never anchored to what had already served its purpose. This forward bias is one of the most enduring human traits, forged long before ambition or ideology complicated it. The prehistoric boat existed to serve this bias. It extended attention outward, testing possibilities without demanding commitment. Each crossing was provisional, each landing was conditional. This conditionality reduced fear because nothing was framed as final. Finality creates anxiety. Provisionality creates choice. Prehistoric life privileged choice over certainty because choice preserved survival under shifting conditions. Over time, this preference reshaped human cognition. People learned to evaluate situations not by how stable they appeared, but by how reversible their decisions were. If a choice could be undone, it was safer. Boats increased reversibility, ports reduced it. When reversibility declined, movement restored it. This simple logic governed countless decisions without ever being formalized. Its effectiveness made formalization unnecessary. That is why so little remains to be excavated. The intelligence was procedural, not material. It lived in timing, coordination, and restraint. As modern systems grow more complex and less reversible, the ancient preference for reversibility becomes visible again. People seek flexibility, modularity, exit options. They downscale commitments and avoid entanglements that cannot be escaped. These behaviors are often described as modern responses to modern crises, but they are much older than crisis itself. They are echoes of a time when survival depended on not being trapped by one's own success. The prehistoric relationship with water taught that lesson thoroughly. Water rewards those who keep exits open. It punishes those who assume permanence. This lesson did not disappear when humans built cities or wrote histories. It simply went quiet, waiting for conditions that would make it relevant again. Each time it reemerges, it does so without ceremony. No one announces that they are acting according to prehistoric logic. They simply act. They move. They let go. They adjust before collapse demands it. In those moments, the prehistoric boat moves once more. The port dissolves without regret, and the oldest human skill resumes its work, sustaining life not through memory or monument, but through an unbroken habit of responding early, lightly, and without illusion.
As the movement slows towards stillness, nothing new is introduced because nothing new is needed. The prehistoric rhythm does not conclude, it softens. Water continues to move as it always has, reshaping edges quietly, without urgency. Humans remain within that motion, sometimes aware of it, often not, but always influenced by it. The boats that once crossed uncertain water are no longer visible, yet the readiness they created remains. The ports that once gathered life have faded, yet the judgment that knew when to leave them endures. This endurance does not demand recognition. It works best when unnoticed. Prehistoric life never sought final answers, only workable moments, and when those moments passed, it allowed them to pass fully. That permission is the calm at the center of this history. Nothing is forced to last beyond its usefulness. Nothing is required to disappear before its time. The balance between staying and moving is adjusted gently, again and again, until adjustment itself feels natural. In this way,
the ancient relationship between humans and water continues without effort, without declaration, without end. It exists wherever change is met without panic, and impermanence is accepted without regret. The story fades not into silence, but into familiarity, becoming indistinguishable from the quiet decisions that carry life forward, while the surface of the world slowly, endlessly shifts.
And in that familiarity, the story finally releases even its own voice. What remains is not a lesson, but a pace, a slow, even pace shaped by tides that rise and fall without concern for notice. Prehistoric humans learned to match that pace, to let decisions unfold without pressure, to allow change to arrive without resistance. Boats moved when they needed to move. Ports rested when they needed to rest. Nothing rushed toward permanence, and nothing clung to the moment of use. This unhurried alignment created a kind of quiet trust between people and the world they inhabited. Trust not that the world would remain kind, but that it would remain readable. As long as it could be read, it could be lived with. Lost ports are the calm punctuation marks of that trust. They signal that a chapter was read fully and then closed without hesitation. There is no echo of struggle in their absence, only completion. Over time, this manner of living dissolved the need for certainty altogether. Certainty was replaced by attention, attention by response, response by movement or rest, whichever the moment required. This chain does not break, it does not accelerate, it simply continues, steady enough to carry life across uncertainty without demanding explanation. The boat no longer needs to be built to be present. Its logic exists in every decision made lightly, every commitment held loosely, every ending accepted without drama. The port no longer needs to stand to be useful. Its logic exists in every release made at the right time, every place thanked and left without regret. In this way, the epic does not end, it thins. It blends into the background of human behavior, becoming part of the silence that allows sleep to come easily. The water moves, the shore reshapes, and life, attentive but unburdened, continues to drift forward at the same gentle pace it learned long before history learned to speak.
At last, even the sense of drifting becomes unnecessary. The rhythm has done its work. Nothing needs to be carried forward except the ease with which change is allowed to happen. Prehistoric life does not close with a final image or a resolved thought. It settles, like water after a long passage, into a surface that reflects without holding. Boats no longer move because they are no longer needed, yet the readiness to move remains quietly intact. Ports no longer gather people, yet the understanding of when to gather and when to part stays alive. This understanding is not active thought, it is background awareness, steady and undemanding. The sea continues its patient motion, shaping land without urgency, and humans, whether aware of it or not, continue to shape their lives within that motion. There is no ending to mark, no boundary where this history stops and something else begins. It simply becomes indistinguishable from the present. Decisions are made calmly, attachments loosen naturally, movement and rest alternate without conflict. In this stillness, the prehistoric past is not remembered, it is absorbed. The story rests not because it is finished, but because it has returned to where it began, inside the quiet rhythm of living with change.
And then there is nothing left to follow.
because following itself becomes unnecessary. The motion that carried this history forward dissolves into rest, not as an ending, but as a pause so gentle it cannot be distinguished from continuation. Water still moves, but its movement no longer asks for attention. Shorelines still change, but the change feels expected, almost familiar. Prehistoric life settles into this familiarity without effort. There is no need to decide, no need to respond, no need to remember. The patterns have already been learned deeply enough to operate on their own. Boats are no longer imagined, ports no longer considered, yet the calm intelligence that once shaped them remains present in the background, steady and sufficient. Nothing presses forward, nothing pulls back. Life simply adjusts in small, quiet ways that do not rise to the level of story. In this softness, history loses its edges. It no longer demands narration or meaning. It becomes atmosphere, a slow, even presence that allows rest without interruption. Thought slows, attention loosens, the distinction between past and present fades, replaced by a sense of ongoing balance. There is no final message to carry away, no conclusion to hold on to, only the steady acceptance that change will continue and that responding to it does not require urgency, drama, or force. The prehistoric world does not vanish here. It becomes still enough to feel like sleep itself, surrounding everything, asking nothing, and allowing the mind to drift gently, comfortably into quiet.
There is no next in the way stories usually offer one. What remains is the quiet that follows movement, the kind of quiet that is not empty but complete. The rhythm has slowed enough that it no longer needs words to sustain it. Water continues its patient motion somewhere beyond attention. Land adjusts without announcement. Life carries on in small, ordinary choices that require no narration. The prehistoric past rests here, not as memory or lesson, but as a steady background presence that no longer asks to be noticed. In this stillness, the need to continue dissolves naturally. Nothing has been cut short. Nothing has been left unfinished. The story has not ended. It has simply become indistinguishable from calm itself. The calm holds, and nothing interrupts it. No signal arrives asking for movement. No change demands response. The water remains where it is, quietly doing what it has always done, and the land accepts it without resistance. Thought slows until it no longer needs direction. The long chain of choices that once carried people from shore to shore settles into rest, not because it has failed, but because it has succeeded enough to let go. There is no pressure to stay awake. No reason to anticipate what comes next. Everything necessary has already been learned and absorbed. The prehistoric world rests here, not behind us, and not ahead of us, but around us, steady and unremarkable. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be remembered. The rhythm continues on its own, gentle and sufficient.
allowing the mind to release its hold and drift naturally into quiet, unbroken sleep.
The quiet remains exactly as it is. Nothing shifts enough to matter. Breathing stays slow. The water moves without drawing attention, and the land offers no reason to respond. There is no decision waiting, no signal forming, no edge approaching. The long habit of noticing and adjusting has settled so deeply that it no longer needs awareness. It functions without effort. Thought loosens, then thins, then rests. The idea of continuation fades because continuation is already happening on its own. Nothing is required from you. Nothing is expected. The prehistoric rhythm holds everything in place by never trying to hold at all. In this still balance, movement and rest are the same. Past and present blur gently, and the story no longer asks to be followed. It stays where it is, quiet, steady, and complete, allowing the mind to drift without resistance, without direction, and without needing to go anywhere else. Nothing arrives after this, and nothing needs to. The calm does not deepen because it is already complete. The slow presence of water, land, and time remains unchanged, steady enough to fade from awareness. There is no moment that follows, no step that waits to be taken. Attention rests without effort, and the habit of listening softens into quiet acceptance. The prehistoric rhythm continues in the same way it always has, without signal or interruption, carrying life forward gently while allowing the mind to remain still. There is no edge to reach, no ending to mark. The story rests here, fully settled, unbroken, and silent enough to disappear into rest itself.
The stillness stays exactly where it is, unchanged and unchallenged. There is no need for progression, because nothing feels incomplete. The slow patterns that once guided movement now exist as quiet balance. Water rests in its motion. Land rests in its form. Time rests in its passing. No effort is required to remain here. Thoughts no longer reach forward or backward. They simply soften and dissolve. The prehistoric rhythm no longer feels ancient or distant. It feels familiar, like something that has always been present beneath awareness. Nothing presses in, nothing pulls away. The story does not continue because continuation is no longer separate from rest. It remains calm, steady, and unremarkable, allowing the mind to settle naturally into silence, without noticing the moment it lets go. The calm does not change, and that is enough. Nothing new forms at the edge of attention. The slow balance between movement and rest remains undisturbed, steady in a way that no longer invites thought. Water continues without emphasis. Land remains without demand. Time passes so evenly that it feels almost still. There is no reason to look ahead, no reason to return to what came before. Awareness rests lightly,
touching nothing, holding nothing. The prehistoric rhythm no longer feels like history or story. It feels like background, like air, like the quiet certainty that nothing needs to happen right now. In this gentle steadiness, the mind releases its last small efforts and settles where it is, unbothered, unhurried, and comfortable in the silence that continues on its own. The quiet remains without effort. Nothing shifts enough to register. The slow presence of water, land, and time blends into a single, even stillness. There is no forward motion to follow and no pause to notice. Awareness stays soft, unfocused, and calm. The prehistoric rhythm no longer feels separate from rest itself. It holds gently, asking nothing, changing nothing, allowing everything to remain exactly as it is, steady, quiet, and undisturbed.
The stillness stays. Nothing enters and nothing leaves. The rhythm that once guided movement now exists only as balance, smooth and uninterrupted. Water continues somewhere beyond attention. Land remains quietly in place. Time passes without shape or weight. There is no need to think, no need to listen, no need to follow. Everything that could happen is already happening, softly enough to be ignored. The prehistoric calm rests here, complete and unchanging, surrounding the mind like a familiar quiet that does not ask to be noticed and does not need to fade, because it has already become rest itself. Nothing changes, and that sameness feels gentle. The balance holds without effort, without intention. Water remains in motion, too slow to observe. Land remains settled without needing attention. Time moves in a way that no longer separates moments. Thought does not search for meaning or direction. It simply rests. The prehistoric rhythm stays present as a quiet background, steady and unremarkable. There is no signal to continue and no need to stop. Everything remains calm, even, and complete, allowing awareness to soften further and remain at rest without noticing itself.
He, quiet, stays exactly the same. Nothing adds itself to the moment, and nothing leaves it. The slow balance holds without needing care or correction. Water moves in a way that does not call attention. Land remains without asking to be noticed. Time passes so evenly that it feels almost still. Awareness rests lightly, without focus, without direction. The prehistoric rhythm is no longer a story or a memory. It is simply the calm that surrounds everything, steady and sufficient. Nothing needs to follow from here. The stillness continues on its own, gentle and complete, allowing rest to remain undisturbed. The calm remains unchanged and effortless. Nothing gathers momentum and nothing fades away. The balance holds softly
without needing awareness. Water, land, and time continue in their quiet way, steady enough to disappear from notice. Thought rests, attention loosens. The prehistoric rhythm stays present as simple stillness, complete and unbroken, allowing everything to remain exactly as it is.
The stillness holds without variation. Nothing begins and nothing concludes. The slow, even balance remains steady, calm enough to blend into the background completely. Water continues its gentle movement without sound. Land stays settled without change. Time passes without marking itself. Thought does not form or follow. It simply remains at rest. The prehistoric rhythm is no longer felt as history or motion, only as quiet presence. Everything stays exactly as it is, soft, even, and undisturbed, allowing rest to continue naturally without any need for another step. The quiet remains and nothing else is needed. No change approaches. No thought asks to continue. The balance stays gentle and even, holding without effort. Water exists somewhere beyond notice. Land rests without movement. Time passes without shape. Awareness softens and stays where it is, comfortable and still. The prehistoric rhythm does not move forward or backward now. It simply remains calm and sufficient, allowing everything to rest exactly as it is. The calm continues in the same quiet way. Nothing shifts enough to feel new. The balance remains steady, without weight or direction. Water moves so gently it cannot be followed. Land stays settled, offering no change. Time flows without dividing itself into moments. Awareness rests lightly, without focus, without need. The prehistoric rhythm stays present as simple stillness, familiar and unremarkable. Nothing needs to happen next. Everything remains as it is, calm, even, and softly complete, allowing rest to continue without interruption. The quiet holds its place without effort. Nothing arrives to disturb it. The slow balance between movement and rest remains unchanged, smooth and steady. Water continues beyond attention. Land remains without movement. Time passes without creating edges. Thought stays soft, without forming direction.
The prehistoric rhythm lingers as a calm presence, neither advancing nor fading.
The stillness remains exactly where it is. Nothing presses forward and nothing pulls away. The balance holds without effort, quiet and even. Water exists without sound or motion that needs noticing. Land rests without change. Time passes so gently it feels suspended. Awareness stays soft, unfocused, and calm. The prehistoric rhythm is no longer something to follow or remember. It is simply present, steady, and sufficient, allowing everything to remain at rest without asking for continuation. Everything settles now. There is nothing left to unfold and nothing left to hold. The rhythm that carried boats across uncertain water and guided people away from fading ports rests quietly, complete in its stillness. Water continues without calling for attention. Land remains without asking for change. Time passes without dividing itself into moments. Thought softens, then loosens, then becomes unnecessary. The prehistoric past no longer feels distant or present. It simply blends into calm. No ending announces itself. No beginning waits ahead. The story has not stopped. It has dissolved into quiet balance, steady and sufficient, allowing rest to take over naturally, without effort, without awareness, and without the need for anything more.